Hello, everybody. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person, and even sorrier that we're all missing the central point of the Parnell lecture, which is the party afterwards. But hopefully we'll be able to make restitution for that at some point in the future. This lecture is in honor of the great Eamon Duffy, who is, of course, a wonderful historian and was also a very good friend of Seamus Heaney's, who had such an affectionate relationship with Magdalene. So in honor of Eamon, I thought it would be appropriate to talk about Seamus Heaney and history and Heaney's complex attitude to history. On April the 24th, 1960, the Wolfe Tone Dramatic Society, I'm going to show you this. So this is the ad. The Wolfe Tone Dramatic Society in Balahi, County Derry, staged a one-act melodrama, James Ignatius Fanning's Melody Alone, about the last hours of the Irish nationalist hero, the archetypal Irish nationalist hero indeed, Robert Emmet. Plays about Emmet, who was executed in Dublin in 1803, following a grimly abortive attempt at a rising, had long been a staple of popular Irish nationalist culture. The audience that flocked to the Gaelic Athletic Association, GAA Hall in the village, would have known the main characters, as well as a Greek audience would have known the figures from collective myths they were about to see in a tragedy by Euripides. As well as Emmet, there was his sweetheart, Sarah Curran, the insidious informer, Leonard McNally, and the cruel Major Sir. This was not just a historical drama, it was history understood as drama. Emmet embodied the idea of resistance, defeat, and resurrection that was evoked in 1848, 1867, and 1916. While his martyrdom, for the most part, has been sentimentalized into a lachrymose harmlessness, it could still be incendiary. Patrick Pearse, leader of the 1916 Rising, saw himself quite explicitly as a reincarnation of Emmet. This 1960 production, moreover, was being staged in Unionist-dominated Northern Ireland. Both the play and its context were loaded with signifiers of allegiance to an oppositional nationalist culture. Emmet, Wolfe Tone, the GAA. You can see even on that small ad from the Middlester Observer, GAA, Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet. Each of these is a very powerful signifier of nationalist identity. So alongside the actual performance, there was inevitably on such an occasion the implication of a much larger drama being imagined collusively by the audience, Irish nationalism at some point in the future, fulfilling its long thwarted destiny, which of course was to finally and completely break the link with England. The resonance of this in Northern Ireland in 1960 is obvious. The star of this particular production, playing Robert Emmet himself, was a student from the local area. The reviewer from the Mid-Ulster Observer, see it here, this is the review from the 28th of April 1960, was stunned by the performance of the leading man. He was impressed in particular at the notion that this actor was almost reincarnating Robert Emmet. So it wasn't just a representation of Emmet. In the review, this particular performance is seen as if it's an inhabiting of the character of Emmet. And of course, that's particularly loaded. If you go back to Pearson, you go back to the whole idea of the reincarnation of Emmet. Never, said the reviewer, can there have been a more true characterization Is there a better portrayal of the Darlin of Erin? We think not. This fiery, idealistic, and noble, Robert Emmet, all words used by the reviewer, was Seamus Heaney, who had just celebrated his 21st birthday. Now, obviously, this is just a moment in the early life of the poet, but even within this little vignette, I think we can see two things. First thing we can see is that Heaney, as a young man, could not avoid a very specific and inherited notion of what history means and where it is tending. Indeed, the evidence suggests that he was both willing and able at that point in his life to inhabit a communal, even tribal history. The other thing that's striking, though, is that Heaney chose as a poet to forget or elide this moment. In Stepping Stones, his marvelous book of autobiographical interviews conducted by the late Dennis O'Driscoll, Heaney does mention, and I quote, historical pageants based on the rebellion and capture and execution of Robert Emmet. This might seem to be a reference to himself playing Emmet with such passion and such a vivid impact that he could make in his local community at that time. But in fact, he refers to this only in the context of seeing these Robert Emmet melodramas being performed, not of himself being an incarnation of Emmet. He mentions a traveling professional troupe. While I've no doubt that these traveling professional troupes would indeed have been a commonplace in Balahi and elsewhere, it's striking that he does not mention the amateur performances in which he himself was involved. And immediately after this answer, when he talks about seeing these traveling professional troupes performing Emmet melodramas, the historical pageants, as he called them, Dennis O'Driscoll asks him whether seeing such plays imbued him with an ambition to perform. And Heaney's reply is strange and striking. It is not at all. So he's making what seems to be a pretty clear claim that there was no connection between himself as a performer, even as a young man, and these Emmet melodramas that he saw. Now, the point here is not going to be particularly shocking to anyone, is not that writers, poets especially, invent their pasts, choosing what is useful and what can be discarded. Of course they do. They probably wouldn't be very interesting if they didn't. It's rather that what is discarded can sometimes be a source of creativity just as much as what is chosen. In this case, there's a richly fertile kind of unease, a willed amnesia that proves to be imaginatively potent in ways that I'll try to talk about over the next few minutes. Throughout his poetic career, Heaney would explore a number of alternative ways of thinking about history and using history. And this restlessness would fuel, I think, some of his greatest work. This is perhaps a lesson in the importance of having to live down one's youthful triumphs. To go back for a moment to this appearance in the GAA Hall as Robert Emmet, a striking aspect of it is that it's not an isolated incident from this time. It's actually one of three local interventions by him in 1959 and 1960 that harked back to these very resonant dates in Irish nationalist history. Three particular dates: 1798, 1803, 1916. Heaney's 1978 moment came a year before his Emmett performance, when he made his debut with the Wolfe Tone Players in another nationalist melodrama, For the Land She Loved, set during the 1798 Rising. This particular play by Seamus Heaney had its own history. In 1915, when it was produced in the Abbey in Dublin, Dublin Castle, the British administration remonstrated with the manager of the Abbey, St. John Irvine, for, quote, permitting this piece of sedition to be performed. And Irvine in turn responded by barring de Burgh from the Abbey. So this was clearly a play that within certain contexts could be understood as seditious. And subsequent to his performance as Emmett, so the 1798 play is before Emmett, then there's Emmett, and then there's sorry, in the middle of these two rather is Heaney's involvement in a local event that could be seen in the contemporary context of Northern Ireland in 1960 as also having a potentially subversive or seditious effect, which is a showing of George Morrison's pioneering archival film, Misha Era. With a stirring score by Sean Riada, famously still often used as the Dark Rosaleen theme from it, and a triumphal narration by Sean McGrayaman. The film sweeps the viewer through from the beginning of the 20th century to the 1916 Rising and Sinn Féin's victory in the 1918 general election. It made a huge impact because nobody had ever made a film like this before, right? So it was really the first serious attempt to mine the archive of particularly newsreel footage from the time to put together a narrative of what used to be called the Troubles, until, of course, that term would be taken over by more immediate events. And certainly the period leading up to the great triumph of Sinn Féin's general election victory in 1918. Misha Era was avowedly and openly on the side of Irish nationalism, and it was an entirely uncritical presentation of this period. And it was embraced by the Irish state. Eamon de Valera, who of course was the last surviving commandant of the 1916 Rising and a dominant figure in the history of the Irish state, was then president of Uachtar Maharan, and he attended the premiere of the film in Dublin, conferring on it the blessing not just of de Valera as the current president, but of course also de Valera as the representative of those historic forces. But conversely, and I think this is what is even more interesting in terms of this particular showing of Misha Era that we're going to talk about, in September 1960, the police committee of Belfast Corporation recommended the banning of the film in Belfast. This decision was subsequently reversed, but it gives some idea of the tension Misha Era could generate in Northern Ireland by inserting an incendiary nationalist historiography so vividly in the form of this newsreel film into the context of a unionist ideal of history, with, of course, its own origin myth rooted in exactly the same period. So this is a competing narrative that, through the power of the moving image, doesn't just seem to be historical, right? You have to remember that people are not as inured at that time to the idea of seeing historical events put together in this sort of visual narrative form as they would be now. So it's a competing narrative to the official one of the foundation of the Northern Ireland state itself. Now, what you can see hopefully on screen is the advertisement for the showing of Massacre, again in the Wolf Tone Hall in Balahi on 25th, 26th and 27th of March 1960. And the advertisement itself is very interesting. It bristles with this tension. You know, this is appearing just on a page of local ads, right? So the sale of some pigs somewhere, you know, the what's going on elsewhere in the movies in Marifelt or whatever else. So, but this one is not like that. So it's headed, if you can make it out, the top line there is headed in capitals: "See history as it actually happened." Not, the implication goes, as it's supposed to be. Supposed to be in Northern Ireland. It stresses at the bottom line the furtive and fugitive nature of the event. This is the second showing of this film in the 6 counties. And by the way, 6 counties, of course, is also weighted as a term, not Northern Ireland, which is a place unrecognized in nationalist discourse. 6 counties as a term implies the missing 26, or the bit that's missing from the 26, and the bit that's missing from the 32. And then it goes on, and it will be the only chance South Derry people will have of seeing it. So, although this is not itself a melodrama, it purposefully has a sense that this is a contemporary nationalist melodrama. It's the very showing of the film is itself a kind of act of defiance of an official historical narrative. And you may not be able to make it out, but sandwiched between these 2 dramatic lines are the mundane details. Tickets for Friday and Sunday showing can be had at Breslin's shop, Diamond Cafe, from Seamus Heaney, phone Balahi 257. So we can thus see Heaney in his student days, at least within his own community, as a very active participant in the presentation and also the physical embodiment within that community of a version of history that is, paradoxically, both orthodox and subversive, official and incendiary. It is, on one side of the border, the dominant narrative of the Republic of Ireland, and on the other side of the border, which of course Heaney inhabits, the dangerous underground reservoir of a disloyalty to Northern Ireland and to the United Kingdom. Now, the fascination is that this intense experience for Heaney over these 2 summers leaves so few traces in the poetry. It is referenced glancingly in his prose. Not the Massacre, so far as I know, but the performances, the 2 performances, are very, very briefly and glancingly referenced, although, as I said, strikingly left out of Stepping Stones. Yeah, and also my guess would be, and this is a matter of interpretation, would be that his Emmett performance, the Robert Emmett performance, has a bearing on what Helen Wendler tellingly calls the most clipped, dry, and impeccable of the Sweeney poems in Station Island, the old icons, which begins, "Why, when it was all over, did I hold on to them? A patriot with folded arms in a shaft of light, the barred cell windows and his sentenced face are the only bright spots in the little etching." This actually matches the scenario of Melody Alone, the play in which Heaney played Emmet. It's Emmet's last night before his execution. But three things are briefly worth noting. There is that opening question, why, when it was all over, did I hold on to them, implying that this is an image that ought to have been discarded long ago. There is the transformation of the drama in which he played into an etching. It's as if he's looking at a picture rather than actually himself being the embodiment of this figure. And there is the fact, perhaps not that significant, one can maybe read too much into it, but nevertheless, it is interesting that the old icons, unlike most of the Sweeney Rededivius poems, is a notable absence in Heaney's own chosen new selected poems, 1966 to 1987. The Emmet experience seems to exist, as in the poem itself, in a very thin shaft of light. And it's interesting here that it's not, of course, that Heaney cannot make poetry out of student amateur dramatics. In The Real Names from Electric Light, he builds a whole marvelous sequence from memories of school productions of The Tempest and Macbeth at St. Colum's in Derry in 1953 and 1954. And of course, he could also make poems out of film shows in the local neighborhood. One of his most beautifully poignant poems draws on a matinee showing of Treasure Island, which provides which was on the draft-prone screen of the club rooms in Castle Dawson. And it provides the framework for The Attic, that beautiful late Heaney poem from Human Chain. So, you know, amateur dramatics and local film shows are grist to the poetic mill, except not the ones that he's most directly involved with and most dangerously involved with in terms of what those presentations might mean within the political context of the time. So it's not the subject matter in general, which it seems to be is the problem. It's the history contained within it, or at least this very particular version of history. Now, history, as James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus famously claims in Ulysses, is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. And of course, that's a touchstone for so many contemporary Irish writers. But the problem, in fact, is not so much that Irish history is an uneasy dream, as the quotation seems to imply, as that it's too much of a wide awake reality. It never sleeps. Irish history, or at least that side of history that's shaped by what is so euphemistically called the national question, one of those wonderful euphemisms like the Troubles, will not recede into the past. As the all too Irish Mary Tyrone puts it in Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, the past is the present, isn't it? It's the future too. We all try to lie out of that, but life won't let us. In this, it is not like that other great source of poetic imagery for Heaney, personal memory. In memory, the past has ceased to be experienced. So it has moved from being experienced to being image. In Irish history, as it's continuing to unfold, of course, the past is still being experienced. There is no recollection in tranquility possible because the tranquility does not exist. And not just experienced, but instrumentalized politically, often with violent consequences. Heaney spoke in his lecture on W.H. Auden of, quote, conditions where the ground might open up under the present. But the problem with the Troubles that Heaney lived through is that the conditions often feel like all subterranean opening up rather, and no solid ground. The footing in the present is always tenuous. Heaney's bogs are literal, of course, but they're also places where the past keeps opening up under the present. As in kinship, this center holds and spreads, sump and seedbed, a bag of waters, and a melting grave. So Irish history, as encoded in the tribal politics of Northern Ireland, is also something even more deadly than this unstable ground, at least for the poet. What's more deadly is cliche. The flight from cliche, that is the prime directive of poetry, must also be a flight from communal history. To keep poking it, as the ghost of James Joyce warns Heaney in Station Island, is raking at dead fires, a waste of time for somebody your age. That subject people stuff is a cod's game. Yet, there wouldn't really be any tension if that were simply true. The problem is that the subject people stuff is for Heaney both an internal and an external reality. And in neither guise can it be so easily ditched as James Joyce, his James Joyce suggests in Station Island. It's woven into Heaney's own consciousness. As the chorus puts it in the part of The Cure at Troy, that is not endlessly quoted by politicians. And one of my ambitions in this lecture is not to use that quotation. I don't know if I can manage it, but anyway. As the chorus puts it in The Cure at Troy, highlighting old scars and flashing them round like decorations. I hate it. I always hated it. I am part of it myself. So the externality of this tribal politics of the wound is matched by, and in fact maybe even overmatched by, its internal power. I am part of it myself. Because it is surely also part of Heaney, as these early performances remind us. It is, moreover, an unavoidable context for his poetry. And let's be frank, not an entirely unwelcome one. Heaney is acutely aware of the great allure of its drama, not least in magnifying the public dimension of his own lyric moments. In Exposure, he imagines himself in Wicklow after his move from Belfast, which of course can be seen as a sort of classic flight from history, as a woodcairn escaped from the massacre, a Joycean image of cunning exile from Irish history. But, and this is equally important, this thought rebounds on him, who, blowing up these sparks for their meager heat, have missed the once-in-a-lifetime portent, the comet's pulsing rose. The escape from history is also potentially a wandering off into insignificance. And there's nothing for Heaney to do with this dilemma except to live with it and write out of it. The poet, as Heaney wrote by way of extension to John Keats, must be, quote, displaced from a confidence in a single position by his disposition to be affected by all positions, negatively rather than positively capable. Heaney is allowed, or allows himself, a historical negative capability. Faced with the array of strategies for dealing with history that modern Irish writers have developed, he chooses all positions, everything on the menu, I think. So there are, I would suggest, and I know this is extremely schematic, but sometimes there's something to be said for schema. So I would suggest that there are 6 primary ways of imagining history in contemporary Irish literature, modern Irish literature. And the interesting thing is that I think Heaney adopts and adapts at one time or another all of them, all positions. So what I'm just going to do is go briefly through each of these 6 and give you an example. And none of this is, of course, comprehensive, apart from anything else we'd be here a long time. So the first strategy that's sort of built into modern Irish literature for dealing with history is this nationalist one. And it's eschatological, drawing on the Christian imagery of death leading to resurrection. This is, of course, this is the essential mode of the Robert Emmet myth and of the 1916 Rising. Heaney uses it most obviously, most famously or infamously in the early poem on the 1798 Rising, or 1798 revolutionaries, that he stopped reading in public when the Troubles broke out, Requiem for the Croppies. Of course, in the poem, the narrative voice is that of a dead revolutionary. So it's already the reanimation of the dead. And that's reinforced by the image of the men going to join the fighting, putting seeds, barley seeds in their pockets to sustain themselves, being killed with the seeds in their pockets. They buried us without shroud or coffin, and in August, the barley grew up out of the grave. Now, it's interesting, though, here that Heaney's image is exactly the image of Patrick Pearse in his oration at the graveside of O'Donnell Rossa, which is kind of one of the key sacred texts of the Misha era. According to Pearse, the God, who is an Irish nationalist God, ripens in the hearts of young men the seeds sown by the young men of a former generation. Interestingly, though, this mode becomes dormant for Heaney. So Heaney understands exactly what that begins to mean in the period after the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, and of course then the beginnings of the Troubles in late 1960s Ireland that he inhabits. So he stops reading the poem in public, and in a sense it becomes dormant. It's self-buried. But it's worth just noting that it also arises again. It's as if the seeds planted in that poem sprout again at the end of the conflict. So if that's a sort of pre-conflict poem, at the end of the conflict or towards the end of the conflict in The Cure of Troy, we get a kind of revisiting of it in a way, but also a radical repurposing of it. So it resurfaces, and in the context of the peace process, it's transformed from the Irish reincarnation myth, in which the blood of the undead martyrs feeds the undying revolution, into a resurrection of justice, in which that very death cult is itself left behind. The essence of the nationalist myth is that there is hope only at the side of the grave, that, as Pearse had it in that oration, from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. The grave is precisely the side of the grave that is precisely the site of hope. So we have to read that this famous, perhaps too famous chorus from the Cure of Troy, I think, against Pearse's oration and Heaney's own use of Pearse's oration in the Requiem for the Croppies. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. It's a very direct, blunt contradiction of Pearse. And of course, what it says then is that the famous culminating part of this chorus is outside history. So this is what history says. However, but there's a but, right? And the but is ahistoric, but ahistoric in the sense of how can you be outside history? He knows you can't be outside history, particularly if the peace process itself is a historical process. But it's outside a particular history. It's outside the death cult history of Irish nationalism. It's outside the communal popular history of Robert Emmet and 1916. And so it is, of course, outside of history, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up. Now, that once in a lifetime recapitulates, of course, that once in a lifetime portent of exposure. So we're not. It's not just a relationship to Requiem for the Croppies here. There's a relationship to exposure, but it also repurposes the once in a lifetime in exposure. In exposure, the once in a lifetime comet may be, it's open to the reading, that it's a harbinger of the fulfillment of the nationalist dream. Portents are what in Irish nationalist mythology Robert Emmet is, for example. He's not himself the bringer of the salvation. He's the John the Baptist. So this idea of the portents is very much sewn into that sort of notion of history. So in exposure, it can be read, the once in a lifetime can be read as suggesting that the Troubles do indeed portend the attainment of the final purpose of Irish freedom. Here, at the other side of those Troubles, and in the context of the peace process, that version of history is itself washed away in the tidal wave of justice. Hope and history don't actually rhyme. That may be surprising to some politicians. And here it is the hope that negates the history. It's a hope that's outside of the particular version of history, which has gone into denying it. The second of these 6 ways of dealing with history is a photographic negative of the first. So you have in nationalist history, you have this very powerful notion of the dead being reincarnated as the next generation's martyrs, who themselves will be reincarnated until the final moment comes. But the photographic negative of that is the ways in which the refusal of the martyred dead to lie down and die is reconfigured really as Gothic, as a continual return of the repressed. At its most powerful, as in Lady Gregory and W.B. Yeats's play, of course, immensely influential, Kathleen Houlihan, it is both at the same time. So Kathleen Houlihan is both this, of course, this ostensibly this figure of reincarnation of Ireland, but also entirely vampiric, never going away, changing body shape, feeding on the blood of young men. Strange conjunction, really, of nationalism and the Gothic. And of course, this is, just to point to it, this is also a way, that Heaney uses to think about history as it's unfolding. In Casualty, the dead man killed because he has broken our tribe's complicity will not stay in his grave, dawn sniffing revenant. A very vampiric kind of image, isn't it? Plodder through the midnight rain, question me again. After killing the two young men with rifles on a hill are also revenants, as if our memory hatched them, as if the unquiet founders walked again. The Walking Dead, of course, which became a popular phrase through the TV series, is first used by John Singh in Playboy the Western World. It's implicit in a lot of modern Irish literature. The Graball Man in the North poems refuses even to be a cadaver. Corpse and vivid jostle for space. Who will say corpse to his vivid cast? The Bog Queen. It's also, of course, what happens in that poem is the corpse, the dead, is also reconfigured as a fetus, as something about to be born, in a very dark set of images. He's being born, his rusted hair is like a fetus's, his head and shoulders bruised like a forceps baby. Samuel Beckett's image of giving birth astride a grave comes to mind. The Bog Queen, of course, actually rises from her grave. And I rose from the dark, hacked bone, skullware. A third method used by modern Irish writers is a kind of subaltern history, right? So it's obvious enough. It's the standing outside of the great historical narrative, and the point of vision being that of the poor who are too poor to be even participants in the events in a way, the forgotten. And of course, this is also used by Heaney, very, very powerfully. These images of past people who are the anonymous, the forgotten, the nameless, the shadow people, is part of his implied history of the oppressed, which has, of course, implications in terms of the sectarian geography of Northern Ireland and the sectarian geography of South Derry. But it also has familial, very strong familial resonance in terms of thinking about his own ancestors, but has a broader sense that's going to stitch into the poems of the existence of a point of view on life and history, which is from below, from the margins. In Servant Boy and Jobber Among Shadows, old work whore, slave blood, who stepped fair hills under each bidder's eye and kept your patience. Um, this, of course, is also connected to the pun that Heaney likes on the word scullion, the servant class, the scullion, but also, of course, the fact that his father's ancestors were literally called scullion. In England's difficulty, I lodged with the enemies of Ulster, the scullions outside the walls. And of course, this is then in the great elegy, the strand at Loch Beg, spoke an old language of conspirators. This is the way in which this subaltern point of view is largely woven into Heaney's work is through language, and in particular through dialect. So his use of dialect is, so even when it's not explicitly connected to this scullion class, it's drawing on that idea of those who are outside and below. Spoken old language of conspirators, and could not crack the whip or seize the day. Big voiced scullions, herders, feeders round haycocks, and hindquarters talkers in byres. And of course, the wonderful irony that scullions speak is the language that Heaney says he uses in translating Beowulf. So the act of implanting scullion speak into Anglo-Saxon is the working of this, the working through in a way of this subaltern history, and also, of course, finding its place within a kind of reconciliatory narrative that's implied, I think, in the very act of translating Beowulf. The fourth, and I'm just going to run through these, the fourth way in which history is used by contemporary Irish writers is what I call embodied history. Particularly in the work of Irish women writers, the idea that the body contains, the female body and its marks, its bruises, it's the violence done to the body itself, whether it's literal or metaphorical, contains the entire history of Irish women. A very, very powerful strand of historical thinking, which you can see through Edna O'Brien. You can see it in Emer McBride. You can see it even in Sally Rooney. You know, even people are watching normal people. They're getting a version of this in what they're seeing. And just to say, this is of course also something that Heaney uses, knowing in a way that it's dodgy, that the male appropriation of this point of view is a kind of voyeurism, but nonetheless becomes, of course, extraordinarily powerful in the poem Punishment. I am the artful voyeur of your dark brains exposed, and of your brains exposed and darkened combs, your muscles webbing, and all your numbered bones. The fifth method is mock heroic. There's lots of it about. If one were to think of an analogy, a literary analogy, it would be maybe, for example, to some of the work of Stuart Parker, contemporary with some of Heaney's work, play like Northern Star, for example. Turns up in a poem like Wolf Tone, Heaney's poem Wolf Tone, which is a kind of ventriloquism in which Heaney himself inhabits Wolf Tone. in the way in which he inhabited Emmet at one point, much more literally, but does so now with this sort of mock heroic, ironic distance. Tone is Heaney, Heaney is tone in this moment. I affected epaulets and a cockade, wrote a style well bred and impervious to the solidarity I angled for. And of course, in that poem, it's a poem of historic failure. I mean, of the history which didn't happen. Its focus is essentially the failure of the French invasion that Tone was supposed to be leading in 1796. And so this sort of mock heroic tone is sort of appropriate to that notion of failure. The final version of history, and excuse the rush through this, is the longue durée, the way in which one of the strategies Irish writers have used, particularly at the end of their tether about history, is to recreate history as a sort of vast panorama of their own invention. It's interesting that at the time of the original Troubles, I mean, leading into and out of the revolutionary period, the three titans of Irish literature all engaged in extremely long and extremely complex self-inventions of a mythological history. They all become Casaubon from Middlemarch, looking for a theory of everything, as a way to sort of, create a history that they themselves can contain and can direct. Bernard Shaw, with his 5-play cycle Back to Methuselah, Joyce, of course, Finnegan's Wake, and Yeats' A Vision. They're all sort of dealing with history in this particular way. And Heaney, while thankfully not writing anything like A Vision or Back to Methuselah, can also use this mode, right? So he can enter this mode, this sort of longue durée mode, when it's of use to him. There's the clutch of Mesolithic flints in the clay that underruns the valley in Ban Clay, for example. The North poems have an implied structure of long duration. The implication that the current violence in Northern Ireland is a resurfacing and a continuation of an ancestral human violence, which is almost kind of removed from history by being lifted into this very grand plane of mythologized history. But also this can link into with the Scullion, with the subaltern idea of history. In Anna Horish's imagining of his own ancestors, with pails and barrows, those mound dwellers go waist deep in mist to break the light ice at wells and dung hills. Just the thing to note there is pails and barrows are probably not what mound dwellers had, so the anachronism is deliberate. The anachronism elides history in this vast, long scheme. And of course, this becomes very, very potent, I think, in a poem like Funeral Rites. Now, as news comes in of each neighborly murder, we pine for ceremony, customary rhythms. I would restore the great chambers of the Boyne, prepare a sepulchre under the cup-marked stones. The long durée of the period between megalithic Ireland and the Ireland of the 1970s is foreshortened very, very powerfully here. And the sense, in a way, that the news, the living history, can be enfolded somehow into this differently imagined and mythologized kind of history. Now, so look, this taxonomy is not exhaustive, but I believe it there. But it gives some idea, I think, of the dynamic nature of Heaney's negative historical capability. As a poet of memory, his relationship to the past is famously rooted in the specifics of childhood. But as a poet of history, his relationship to the past is unmoored, floating, drawn along on different currents of response to changing needs. Able neither to belong to an inherited historical narrative, nor to be done with it, he hovers between states, zooming in and out of all of them, but landing definitively on none. It is a fine example of the creative benefit of the irresolvable dilemma.